Welcome to week 2 and echolocation in bats, where we're going to be talking about the mammalian ear and sound processing, and what kind of specializations in the auditory cortex and the cochlea and other regions in between the two that bats have in order to do this specialized echolocation behavior. And in the first video, we're going to talk about the behavior. So talk a little bit about the evolutionary escalation between bats and moths, the bat solution to the moth solution and vice versa. And then followed by a discussion about what types of sound signals that bats use in order to echolocate. And then we'll move on in the next 2 videos to the physiology side of things. So 190 million years ago, moths began irradiation, in other words, diversification, alongside of flowering plants. And predators ate a lot of moths during the day, putting a pressure on them. Note that bats had not evolved yet, but that moths already had ears. And I point that out because up until quite recently, biologists had been thinking about moth evolution and the evolution of hearing in moths to have been due to a pressure of bat predation. But it turns out that moths already had ears in order to monitor the world around them, like many organisms do. And that those ears were kind of broadly tuned to respond to lots of different frequencies. Moths evolved nocturnal behavior more than 100 million years ago. I don't know exactly when, but they've been nocturnal for a long time, and it's thought that that was to avoid predators, diurnal predators. Bats evolved 60 million years ago, and some lineages evolved echolocation relatively early on in the evolutionary trajectory of bats and became nocturnal about somewhere between 35 and 50 million years ago. That put a pressure on moths to then respond. And so over evolutionary time, they changed their ears, basically, evolved more sensitivity to echolocation frequencies, very high frequencies that bats use. They also evolved evasive flight reflexes to bat calls and echolocation frequencies. And in some species, they even evolved the ability to scramble echolocation calls. And if we have time in the last video, I'm going to end with a quick story about that. Bats, alternatively then, in this kind of evolutionary escalation that we've observed, have evolved calls at frequencies outside of the moth's ear ranges to echolocate with. And they've altered the pattern and the frequency or the loudness of their calls in order to try to avoid that flight reflex that moths evolved. That's called stealth echolocation. So a lot of species have different ways to do that, and it depends on the moth species that they tend to forage on. So pretty cool stories. There's tons of literature on this if you guys are interested in it. Just look up, bat moth evolutionary escalation, and you'll find lots of interesting things. Hopefully these videos work. So here's a moth and a bat echolocating. You see scoops up the insect at the end. So listen to the rate that he's calling. I'm going to put that back at the start. So you hear that switch from kind of slower pulsing echoes to really rapid pulses as he gets closer. That's called the terminal phase, right before they're going to catch the moth. And you notice that he scoops up with his tail underneath the moth, and partly that's probably because of this evolved diving reflex that the moths have. So here, these are the microbats, the Microchiroptera. And these are small-bodied, really able flyers. They're all insectivores and that use echolocation. And these bats used to be grouped together. So the bottom half of this figure is showing that these microbats are monophyletic if you group them according to morphological characteristics, which is what we used to do before we had genetic tools. So all of the microbats and the echolocating bats are in one group, and therefore we thought that echolocation evolved a single time in the bat lineages. Interestingly, genetic approaches suggest paraphily. So the fact that echolocation may have evolved twice independently in the bat lineages. So that's kind of a side story on the evolution of the behavior. Echolocation is the location of objects by reflected sound, and most of you will already know that bats and a lot of toothed whales and dolphins use this. You may not know that there are some shrews and 2 bird species that also can echolocate. The birds are cave dwellers birds, oil birds, and swiftlet. And so there's a link there if anybody's interested in reading more about those. But the term echolocation was coined by a scientist named Donald Griffin, who, through a series of experiments, discovered that bats use the reflection of their own vocalizations in order to navigate and locate prey. And he did some cool experiments of like taping mouths shut so that they couldn't vocalize as well anyway. And they were unable to navigate very, very well when he did that. He also just determined that their acuity was really strong. They could detect a mealworm from a similar size disc thrown into the air. So we'll learn more about that, but I include this image to remind us that sound can produce really, really accurate images. And I show this because we're such visual animals that it's hard for us to imagine having a representation of shape, a 3D representation created by sound. But this is what bats see, right? They see an image, but it's created by sound. They visualize an image. I see you can't, there's not even a human word for this. Okay, so I'm just gonna move my little bar here if I can. Let me see if I can move it. Yeah, okay. It's blocking things. My recording bar. So bats vary in the types of calls that they use. So there's a lot of different species of bats that echolocate, and they all have their own specific type of call. They'll use specific frequencies, and they use specific frequency patterns, which is what these are. So if you hear somebody refer to an FM call, that's frequency modulated. And essentially what that means is that there's a sweep across different frequencies. So this is this upper graph, which represents one species. And what you can see is that so frequency is on the y-axis here, and time is on the x-axis. So when they give a specific pulse, that's a call, chirp. Their pulse is frequency modulated, meaning that it crosses a lot of frequencies. The opposite of that is a constant frequency, a CF pulse, and that's represented in this lower graph, this other species. And you can see that a big part of the pulse stays at the same frequency. And then there's a frequency modulating component to this call that drops down, and that's an FM-CF call, or a CF-FM. So there's species that use just FM sweeps, and there's species that use CF-FM, a mixture of the two. Another thing you'll notice is that there are harmonics. So what that means is essentially the same structure of call is given at multiple different frequency ranges. So it's best seen over here in these the terminal buzz phase of this upper species, where you can see kind of two different harmonics on top of the base frequency. And so those turn out to be really important because it's the echo, the returning harmonic when the bat gives the call, it goes out and then it bounces off objects and comes back, and that's the echo. And the echo of the harmonics are compared to the fundamental frequency, this lower one, in order to determine a lot of aspects of the object that it bounced off of. So those harmonics turn out to be important. And even the CF-FM calling species also produce harmonics. They're not visualized in this picture here. So what you see finally in this graph, this is time until prey capture. So here's where they capture the species on the right side of the graphs. And so as they're far away in space and time from capture, they're giving slower rates of pulses. And then as they get closer, those pulses increase in intensity and in frequency, as in a rate, as they approach, and then they enter into this terminal buzz phase. And those calls are essentially given in order to get different types of information as they approach the insect and need more fine scale resolution, temporal resolution for catching the moth, especially if the moth is going to use an evasive maneuver. Okay, so now we're going to move into the cues for locating objects that bats use. And we're going to then get into the physiology for each of these things in the next videos. So the first is distance. So the bat needs to know how far away is the moth or the object that they're receiving signals from. Because of course, everything is going to return sound that's solid. So trees, leaves, you know, things that aren't food are going to return calls too. So what they need to do is to be able to really finely perceive those cues into a picture of their surroundings. So distance is measured by the time difference between when they make the call. So this bat calls, and this outgoing sonar vocalization, that chip, goes towards the moth, and then if it hits something, then it bounces off, and this returning echo is perceived by the bat's ear. So that delay, the time delay, is what gives the bat a measure of distance. Obviously, a short delay is a moth that's a lot closer from a long delay. And apparently the FM calls are the best for this for this task, for determining distance, because they are high, because they have multiple frequencies. And so we'll see why that matters when we talk about the kind of the physiological processing, the neural processing. The target range, oh, I already said that. So it turns out that for most bats, or at least, you know, you get a frequency range for the calls that the bats are using, but on average, it's about 58 microseconds of delay for every 1 centimeter the target is away from the bat. So these bats have to be really good. They have to have really fine temporal discrimination in order to tell that a bat is 1 centimeter versus 2 centimeters away. Size is another important aspect of identifying appropriate prey items. And this is determined by a combination of two things about the echoes that are returning: the distance, which is the delay, and the loudness of the echo, which is apparently measured by what's called the subtended angle. You don't need to know that specifically, you need to know distance and loudness of the echo. So in other words, if a small object that's close by would produce a short echo delay, but it would still not be very loud. And that's basically because there's not very much. So if you consider that this entire echo call is the black circle, so that's essentially a surface area here, the moth is only returning a very small subset of that. And so that's going to be perceived as loudness. And if it's loud, then it means the object is bigger. But the bat would know that it was a larger object if it was still the same loudness, but it had a much longer delay. And so you need both the loudness, but also the delay to tell you, is this a small object close by or a big object far away, or vice versa. The next cue that you need to know is azimuth. So where left to right, in other words, if you're looking out in front of you, where in this plane, if you're looking left to right, is an object. And this is something that all animals do, and we use what's called interoral timing and amplitude or loudness, again, differences. So we're going to see this again in the next unit when we talk about prey location and barn owls. So this is if you're looking down on a bat, it's got two ears and it's looking up, I guess, in this picture, straight ahead. And the sound is coming from the right side of the animal. And so the point here is that if a sound is off center from you and it's on your right, it's going to hit your right ear a little bit quicker than it's going to reach your left ear. And so that's represented by time on these two graphs. You can see the right ear is in blue and the left ear is in red. And here's time on the x-axis. And so it hits the right ear faster than it hits the left ear. It's also louder in the right ear because the sound hasn't been attenuated by the head and it's closer, right, to the sound. And so you get an attenuation of the sound in the left ear, the further ear. So those two cues together can be computed by the brain in order to localize the sound as being coming from the left side of the body or the right side of the body. And we do the same thing. That's the same thing that our brains do in order to calculate the interoral. They use the interoral timing difference, in other words, the two-ear timing difference, in order to determine the azimuth of a sound. And so when somebody claps to the right-hand side, you can look exactly there and investigate what that sound was. I'm not going to go into the mechanisms for this today because we are going to touch on it we're going to focus on it in the barn owl chapter next. Okay, elevation, where up to down is an object relative to your head. Is it above you? Is it below you? And for this, again, this is similar to a lot of different species, but bats have a higher acuity for this. They have specialized structures for this. So all mammals have, or most mammals have a pinna, so this external ear. And the shape is actually important for determining elevation in a sound. And if you put, you can do this at home actually, if you put like modeling clay or something and you pack in the inside of your ear, but you leave open the access to the actual cochlea, then, and you close your eyes, then if you clap side to side, you can still hear because you still have an interoral time difference. But if you're directly in front of a person and you clap way up here or way down at the ground, then you can no longer accurately distinguish which direction, up or down, the sound is coming from. So you can actually experimentally do this. And if we were in class, I would have you guys do that. But bats, you can see, have a little different external ear shape. First of all, they have a huge ear relative to their head size compared to us. And they also have this enlarged tragus. So this is a part of the ear that's very large in bats and it's quite small in humans. And that tragus alters the incoming sounds differently for sounds that come from above the ear compared to sounds that come from below. And so what it does is shifts the frequency of the sound a little bit. So you can see the loudness is different as it passes the tragus, and then it alters the frequency a little bit, that tragus does. And so the bat is capable of determining where the elevational location is of an object based on that frequency shift. Okay, and then the last is velocity or speed. So how fast is a target moving and in which direction? And for this, bats use Doppler shift, and we can detect this as well. And here's an example I'm going to show in this video. So a car makes a sound. You know, the engine makes a sound, right? And the frequency or the pitch of that sound doesn't change. It's making the same sound, whether or not it's coming towards you or moving away from you. But as it moves towards you, it sounds higher pitched because the sound waves are actually getting pushed closer together because it's moving towards you. So it's emitting sound, but it's also moving towards its own sound. So it's pushing those sound waves closer together, and sound waves that are closer together sound higher pitched. As it moves away from you, it suddenly starts to sound a little lower in pitch because the sound waves are now, the car's now moving away from its sound waves that are coming towards you. And so they're a little further apart. And so it sounds lower. So here's a, let me make sure this volume is going to be high enough for you guys to hear. So here's a visual and an auditory example of Doppler shift. So hopefully you could hear and see how the car sounded higher pitched at first and then became, and the waves were getting pushed closer together. And then when it passed the person, it sounded lower all of a sudden and the waves were getting further away. Can't get off of this. Okay. So in bats, the long pulses of constant frequency calls, the CF calls, are the best for measuring this because they're high energy. So presumably they can do this with FM sweeps as well, but the CF calls are better for this. And bats' ears and brains are what we call acoustically tuned to the frequency of the CF calls. So if you remember, there is a flat part of the CF call, and that flat part is a very specific frequency. And so there's more sensory receptors or hair cells in the cochlea for that frequency. There's also more neurons in all the brain structures and especially in the auditory cortex that are dedicated to that specific frequency. And so we call that the acoustic fovea, and that refers to the fovea in the retina and the visual system. Again, we can't help but compare things to vision because we are such visual animals. But we call this in bats the acoustic fovea, and we'll refer to this in the next videos too. One thing that's cool is that bats are able to adjust their calls, so the frequency of their calls, when they're actively flying, to be sure that Doppler shift, because of their movement through the environment, doesn't cause the echo, the returning echo, to fall outside of that acoustic fovea. So we're gonna go to the next slide. So there's a representation here. So the Doppler shift is useful in that it allows the bats to detect the speed of a target. But what you don't want is the speed of the bat to change how they're perceiving that. And so this was a cool experiment where they put a bat on a swing, and then as the swing moved forward and the bat was perceiving itself to be moving forward in space, they actually changed the frequency of their calls to compensate for the Doppler shift of that movement. So I'll get the pointer here. So this is what the Doppler shift, the movement of the swing would have this effect on the frequency. It'd change it by almost or more than 1 kilohertz because of how fast the swing is moving the bat forward. And the bat, when it was calling on the swing, compensated for that almost perfectly with when it was forward swinging. Interestingly, when the bat's moving backwards, it gives its normal frequency pulse. And that tells us a little something about how the bat determines how to modify its call. And in other words, if there's no perception of moving forward in space, then they don't frequency modulate their call. And of course, it would make sense evolutionarily, they shouldn't need to modify a call for flying backwards because they're not going to fly backwards to pursue prey. So that's pretty cool, as you can see. Wow. I think that's amazing. So the Doppler shift produced by an insect wing moving up and down. So you can, obviously the bat can detect the movement of large objects like the entire moth moving, but it turns out that bats can also detect more minute Doppler shifts like that produced by an insect wing moving up and down to the accuracy that they can actually understand or guess what's an appropriate species for them to attack based on the frequency of the wing flutter. So this is a picture here of a bat. When it moves its wing towards the bat, then it's, again, because the Doppler effect, it's pushing the echo closer together because it's physically moving closer at the same time the pulse is hitting it. So it's scrunching the echo up, and that's going to be perceived as higher pitch, higher frequency. But when the bat's wing, or sorry, when the moth wing is moving away, then it's going to stretch out the echo. And so you'll get this, when you put it all together, you get this pattern of towards, away, towards, away, towards, away. And what the bat now has is a record of how fast is the wing beating in this moth that I may or may not try to eat. And is that moth an appropriate target? So that's one way that the bats can both determine which direction is the moth flying, and is this an appropriate insect for me to try to eat? Okay, so I'm going to pause this recording here then before we move on to the second video, which is moving into the physiology.